Okay, the United States' attempt to curb Japanese military expansion so as to service their industrial growth, to curb the Japanese policy that violated the US's open door policy in China. The United States policy was to say to the Japanese, we will increasingly put economic restrictions on you to hopefully get you to renounce this policy of expansionism. You are encroaching on the economic opportunities of other imperial states. Make a long story short, this process goes on through the 1930s. And the Japanese were essentially unaffected by these appeals. All right, they were unmoved. You can sort of understand that. Japan has to get these raw materials. It doesn't have them domestically. It's not like the major powers like the United States. Certainly the Great Britain that had critical industrial resources at home, the Japanese had to have them from their point of view. And so now, finally, in the beginning of the 1940s, the United States ultimately put a full embargo on the Japanese. The United States provided the Japanese critical resources. One was oil, the other was scrap iron, which was very valuable to the Japanese, very important to their rising economy. The United States put a full embargo in 1940 on the Japanese. The result, well, it conveyed to the Japanese that something had to be done because the United States was now actively trying to cripple its expansionism. The result was that the United States had to be neutralized from the Japanese perspective. And you know what event that I'm referring to here? All right. December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The objective here was to cripple the Pacific arm of the American Navy such that the Japanese could expand without interference. They knew they were going to continue to expand, and therefore they need to cripple the United States' capacity to project naval power. And that means strike the key base of the United States. And that would be Pearl Harbor in the middle of the Pacific. Indeed, you can see that here, December 7th, 1941, strike on Pearl Harbor. Interesting attack that the major damage done to the U.S. military was in terms of battleships that were damaged or sunk. The problem for the Japanese is the battleship was already an obsolete, outdated instrument by the 1940s, well before the 1940s. Interesting to look at, a wonderfully symbolic piece of military hardware, but of little use. The craft that was important was the aircraft carrier. And the United States aircraft carriers were out of port. It's always interesting why exactly that was. I'm sure people can imagine all forms of intrigue associated with that. Suffice to say that the Japanese did not get the U.S. carriers, which is what you needed to get. And after attacking the United States in what appeared to be a successful attack on the surface in 1941, despite not getting the carriers that would be critical to a U.S. victory not 6 months later at the Battle of Midway, when the Japanese were handed a terrible loss, losing 4 carriers of their own, another matter. But you can see what happens when the Japanese attack the United States at Pearl Harbor. They immediately, therefore, go right into what you'd consider Indonesia today, over to what you would consider Brunei, within the Indonesian archipelago, specifically because that's where there was substantial oil reserves. And they knew that if they were to go into there before taking care of the United States, that the United States would have intervened. So you can see the impetus of the Japanese here was the material resources necessary to industrially advance. In effect, they were mimicking the policies of the West. In any case, to make a long story short, a lot of the drama associated with this attack by the Japanese, where the United States, he says it'll live in infamy. No, it won't live in infamy. It's an attack. You can consider it provoked or unprovoked or not, but when you think of major expressions of infamy, historically, this will not rate. All right. The Japanese even tried to legally declare war, but they messed up on the time zones on the declaration. Let's not worry about it. Suffice to say, it'll surprise no one at all to realize that the Japanese would come to lose World War II in the Pacific. This is the Japanese Empire at its height in 1942, which is oddly enough not unlike the Germans at their height in, late 1942. And the Japanese would be slowly pushed back to Japan because Japan had attacked a major industrial power of the United States. And attacking an industrial power of note that can just outproduce you to such an enormous extent is truly an expression of optimism that you are going to prevail in such a conflict. In any case. Now, I won't go into any more fineries of that. It's fun to talk about. Now, look at the problem. Well, I should say, look at the circumstance the Japanese have after World War II. They lose to the United States. The United States gives rather impressive terms of surrender, of course, after using a nuclear weapon. All right. The United States gave rather favorable terms to the Japanese. The United States used a nuclear weapon because it was projected that the cost of going into the Japanese islands, direct invasion, would have been extremely bloody. No doubt it was, because the previous island hopping campaigns, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and many others, were extremely bloody, and the United States didn't want to do that. So it used a nuclear weapon, which did bring about the desired result. But afterwards, the United States gave rather generous terms to the Japanese. And by the way, the principal reason for that is the United States wanted to ally against the Soviet Union. At the end of World War II, the United States was concerned that the Russians might want to take over Japan. So the United States figured, let's ally with the Japanese and use it essentially as a bulwark or a base against communist expansion, be it from Russia or China. Now, so Japan loses World War II, but its circumstance is interesting. Because look what happens at the end of World War II. This is 1945 here, this graph here. And you can see the United States, this is the size of the U.S. economy compared to its competitors. And you can see that the United States is just overwhelmingly dominant after World War II. It's 35% of the world economy itself. It's only got a mere fraction of the world's population. Nobody is close to the United States in power. And now the Japanese are allied to the United States. Well, since the United States is utterly dominant, not only in terms of who dominates in the American domestic market, but the United States can outproduce other countries and sell other countries in their own domestic markets. You can outproduce German products in Germany, outproduce French products in France. And what that means is the United States wanted to have a free trade doctrine, because when you're dominant in terms of controlling your domestic market and the domestic markets of other countries, what you want is absolute free trade with no tariff barriers, so that you can gain as much access and get as much benefit of your power as possible. Well, that happens to benefit the Japanese, because the Japanese have to have access to the vast majority, the vast quantities of raw materials that they need. They don't need blockages. And fortunately for the Japanese, the United States foreign policy promoted an international landscape of fairly open trade. So the Japanese found that being an ally to the United States after World War II meant there was no problems getting the raw material resources that they needed. Now, what you'll see is the Japanese lose in 1945, but they quickly leap back from defeat, as you can see here. And are challenging the United States in critical sectors of the United States' industrial power, international market share. And I'll give you some examples here in a minute. What allowed the Japanese to suddenly recover from defeat in 1945 to within 2 decades being so well organized industrially and so profitable to be challenging the United States in critical industries, especially the auto industry and others, was an event you need to know, and it has to fundamentally do with geography. Look at the circumstance that the Japanese found themselves after World War II. They lose in 1945. Well, not 5 years after the end of World War II, the United States is on the Korean Peninsula in the Korean War, which went 50 to 53. The United States is opposing the spread of its interpretation, the spread of communism. And therefore, the United States is prosecuting a war on the Korean Peninsula. And look at the problem the United States has. It has to fight this war on the Korean Peninsula, but for the products that it needs, the goods that it needs, the material that it needs, it's produced in the industrial core of the United States over here, which means you've got to produce the stuff over here, put it on a ship, go through through the Caribbean, through the Suez Canal, through the Panama Canal, and then halfway across the planet, and then you've got to get all the way to Japan, all the way to Korea. Well, it's costly. It's not going to arrive in a timely fashion. This is a pain in the neck to try to prosecute this war. A solution for the United States in terms of prosecuting this war, wouldn't it be nice if we, the United States, could get our goods and produce our goods in right near to the theater itself? And that means Japan is right next door. How convenient. And so what happens is the United States invests heavily into the Japanese growing or nascent industrial core. In fact, it was the seed money of the United States to produce trucks for the U.S. military in Korea, in Japan, that became the base and core of the Japanese auto industry that within decades would be challenging the United States at home in its own market producing cars. Remember, the deal that the United States gave to the Japanese was, we want to infuse great industrial capital into your domestic economy here to help us produce goods to prosecute this war in Korea. But also, anything extra you Japanese produce, you can sell in the American market. We'll give you access to that market. No problem. So this was a fantastic opportunity for the Japanese because they essentially got an injection of industrial capital that adrenalized their economy after World War II. And so they leapt through this window of opportunity. Soon the United States would become, and by the way, the factories that were put in Japan to service U.S. military needs were modern factories, obviously, which means they, at the time they started producing, could already outproduce their contemporaries back in the United States, which were legacy factories that were riven with inefficiencies. And so, as I mentioned, this would become the base for the Japanese auto industry, which you know so well today. Fine, that's the opportunity, a geostrategic window of opportunity for the Japanese right after World War II. That's the Korean War. And then what happens after that? There's a war in Vietnam. The United States is prosecuting another war in Vietnam. You can say it goes from 65 to 73. Some would say 65 to 75. Let's not worry about the specifics here. All right. The United States has the same problem. And this time it injects tons of more money back into Japan to produce goods in Japan, for its war in Vietnam, but also monies into South Korea and Taiwan to do the same thing. In fact, the labor forces in South Korea and Taiwan are going to be cheaper than those in Japan, so why don't invest in these two areas? And so a lot of industrial capital or industrial opportunity goes into South Korea and Taiwan because of the geostrategic opportunity that's provided, that the Vietnam War provided them. Therefore, you now know the reason why Japan not only could recover so quickly from World War II, but also the historical reason why these are the three developed countries in the region. If I was to ask you what are the three developed countries in the region, it's Japan, Korea, meaning South Korea, all right, and Taiwan. That is referred to, as you can see here, as the Dakota Triangle. The Dakota Triangle, that's Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And you saw the geostrategic opportunity that the United States provided for these countries to leap into the industrial elite producers of the world, especially Japan and South Korea. I am not suggesting this was a gift done to these countries by the United States. It was not. The United States did so for its own geostrategic initiatives. It just had a consequence that was not predictable, or some would say. It certainly was not the main objective. And I'm not suggesting that the well-ordered workforces of Japan or Korea aren't to be commended. But there are plenty of hard workers in the world and plenty of states that do a good job of organizing their workforce that do not reach developed country status, like Japan and South Korea specifically has, and to a lesser degree Taiwan. It's because of the geostrategic opportunity provided by the United States that these countries are developed today. Lest I ask you on a test, you know what the answer to that is.